The morning after was wrapped in a soft hush, broken only by the cooing of doves nestled in the tiled eaves above the villa. Dew clung to the grapevines like a thin silver veil, shimmering as the first golden light trickled over the horizon. Marcus stood once again at the edge of the fields, his hands resting calmly on his hips, breathing in the scent of moistened soil and lemon balm drifting on the breeze. There was something timeless in the stillness, a knowledge that long before him, others had stood just like this, watching the earth slowly awaken from its dreams. Spring was deepening now. The barley had taken root, rows of green beginning to stretch toward the sun, like eager children reaching for their mother's hand. The scent of mint and rosemary spilled from the herb garden, and the bees, those tireless, humming companions, had begun returning to the hives with yellow-stained legs. Everything was moving forward, quietly but confidently, and Marcus knew that the rest of the year would follow the tone this season set. If they worked with care now, the earth would reward them with bounty later. He trusted the rhythm of the seasons more than any philosophy written in stone. Julia joined him, brushing sleep from her eyes and pulling a wool shawl close around her shoulders. She walked in silence beside him, her bare feet damp from the grass, eyes wide with wonder at how much the fields had changed in just a few days. Marcus smiled as he watched her, not because she was growing into a woman, but because she still looked at the land with a child's awe. That wonder, he believed, was what made a good farmer. The land responded best to those who treated it like a living story, one worth listening to. Their tasks for the day were measured and intentional. Marcus assigned Lucan and Gaius to the upper terraces to reinforce the stone borders that prevented erosion, while he and Julia turned compost near the orchard, working side by side beneath the warming sun. The compost pile was alive in its own way, teeming with small creatures that made decay into life. Marcus knelt beside it, showing Julia how to fold and dry straw to balance the moisture, how to judge readiness by smell alone. It should smell earthy, never sour. Livia spent her morning in the shaded courtyard near the kitchen, boiling lentils and mixing fresh goat cheese with herbs for preservation. She hung clusters of lavender from the beams to dry, filling the air with calm and comfort. The villa's walls were lined with clay jars and woven baskets, each holding the season's memory: dried figs, pickled onions, sun-dried tomatoes. She moved through it like a quiet priestess in a temple of nourishment, her hands as skilled as any healer's. Every movement she made felt like an offering, not just to the family, but to life itself. By midday, the sun climbed higher, soft shadows stretched shorter, and the family paused for rest. Under the fig tree once again, they sat in the shade, sipping chilled water steeped with lemon and mint, letting the coolness seep into their bones. Publius joined them, his quiet presence like the steady hum of the earth. He didn't say much. He never did, but when he did speak, it was usually to share a proverb, an old lesson tucked into a few simple words. Today he simply said, "The seed that sleeps too long never sees the sun," then sipped his water and closed his eyes again. Marcus looked around the circle and felt that familiar warmth in his chest, not pride, exactly, but something quieter. Fulfillment. He had seen empires rise and fall through rumors brought by travelers. He'd heard of gold, of temples, of warships sailing to far coasts. But none of that called to him. This gentle cadence of family and field was more valuable than any conquest. As the afternoon unfolded, Marcus took Julia to the olive grove, their sandals crunching softly over the dry path. Though the trees wouldn't bear fruit until late summer, they needed trimming and care now. He taught her how to prune the branches without harming the tree, to take only what was necessary to help it grow stronger. "You don't force a tree," he told her. "You guide it like a river, and you thank it always." She nodded, her hands careful, respectful. The light fell through the silvery leaves in soft dappled patterns, dancing across their shoulders. Like blessings. Later that day, as the sun began its gentle descent, casting a warm blush over the sky, Livia called them in with the soft ringing of a bronze bell. Dinner was simple again. Lentils with coriander, stewed vegetables, fresh bread still warm from the oven. They ate together, the way they always did, with soft voices and smiles. The day's labor had sunk into their muscles, but the peace in. Their hearts made the fatigue feel earned, even welcome. After the meal, Marcus brought out his lyre, strumming a few soft notes as the sky deepened to violet. Julia hummed along, inventing melodies as the stars began to prick the darkening dome above. Livia lit a small oil lamp, and the family lingered in the gentle light, telling stories, some real, some imagined, as the night wrapped around them like a warm shawl. Before bed, Marcus walked once more around the villa's perimeter. The goats were resting quietly in their pen. The chickens were nestled on their perches. The bees were silent. And above, the moon had risen, full and patient, keeping watch over all things. He stood beneath it, hands behind his back, breathing in the coolness, the scent of lavender and loam, and the quiet beating of life all around. The year was only just beginning, but already it felt like a promise fulfilled. Summer arrived not with fanfare, but with a gradual intensity, like a pot warming on the hearth. The air grew heavier, more fragrant with pine resin and ripening figs, and the sun lingered long into the evenings, painting the fields in gold and bronze. Life on the villa adjusted itself naturally, as it always did, to the rising heat and slower rhythms. Marcus awoke earlier, often before the first cockcrow, to tend to the fields in the cool, blue stillness of dawn. This was the season of diligence, not of planting or harvesting, but of guarding, nourishing, and maintaining. The barley had turned golden and was nearly ready. The wheat whispered in the breeze like dry parchment, and the vines swelled with promise under the watchful eye of the sun. The olives, too, were forming, tiny green knots clinging to the silvery branches. All around, the land spoke of effort nearing reward, of patience on the brink of fulfillment. Julia had grown stronger. Her arms, once delicate from the early days of sewing, now bore the tone of labor, olive picking, vine trimming, water hauling. But with the strength came a deeper understanding. She moved differently now, not like a guest in the land, but like part of it. She had begun keeping a journal too, not in the scholarly sense, but a private scroll of sketches, pressed flowers, and observations about the stars, the wind, and the way bees behaved differently on hot days. She often read it to Marcus in the evenings, her voice slow and thoughtful, as they sat in the shade of the almond tree. Lucan and Gaius, their tunics soaked in sweat by midday, worked the threshing floor with practiced coordination, separating grain from chaff with wooden flails and broad wicker baskets. They laughed often, even when tired, and sang old working songs between tasks, songs Marcus barely remembered from his own youth. It pleased him, this continuity, not just of work, but of song, of spirit, of joy. Livia, despite the heat, kept the kitchen lively with the scent of stews and flatbreads. She found ways to keep meals fresh: pickled cucumbers, herbed cheese, chilled grape must. She brewed spiced vinegar drinks that cooled the body and lifted the mind, sharing them with neighboring farms when their carts passed along the dusty road. Her hospitality, like her food, was generous without extravagance. It was rooted in something deeper than etiquette, something sacred. As days grew longer and the sun climbed higher in the sky, rest became as important as labor. Marcus insisted on it. A tired hand plants weak roots, he'd say, calling everyone into the shade during the hottest hours. They'd gather under linen canopies, eating cold lentils and honeyed bread. sipping from clay cups while cicadas chorused in the trees. Often, silence reigned, not from exhaustion, but from peace. The kind of silence that only exists between people who know and trust one another completely. One particular afternoon, a traveling merchant passed through, an older man with bronze rings on every finger and a cart full of trinkets from distant provinces. He brought cinnamon from Syria, amber from Germania, and tales from Egypt, where the Nile was said to rise like magic from the stone. Julia listened with wide eyes, but Marcus watched her carefully, not to shield her curiosity, but to measure it. Curiosity was the first root of change, and while he welcomed it, he also hoped it wouldn't pull her too far from home too soon. Later that evening, as the moon rose over the dry hills and the scent of jasmine floated in from the courtyard, Marcus spoke gently to Julia. "The world is vast," he said, "but the earth is always beneath your feet. Wherever you go, remember how this soil feels. That's how you know where you belong." She didn't respond with words, only nodded and leaned her head on his shoulder. They sat like that until the oil lamp sputtered out dot by midsummer. The wheat harvest began. It was the most demanding part of the year, requiring every hand and every moment of daylight. Sickles moved in rhythm, bundles were stacked high, and the air filled with the earthy scent of cut stalks. Marcus worked alongside, his family and workers not above them, his hands rough and brown, his face lined from years of sun and smiles. They celebrated the first full wagon with fresh bread and wine, pouring a libation into the soil in thanks. Publius offered a quiet blessing in the old tongue, and even the animals seemed to bow their heads in solemn joy. For Marcus, each harvest was more than food. It was proof of harmony between man and land, between past and present, between silence and song. As the last rays of sun dipped behind the cypress trees and the day folded itself gently into dusk, the fields shimmered with the stillness of a job well done. Fireflies blinked above the orchard, and Julia, hair streaked with straw, laughed as she chased one through the tall grass. Livia called her in gently, the sound of her voice like music at the end of a long dance. Marcus stood at the field's edge once more, just as he had in spring. But now, the air was warm and full of life, and his heart beat with the quiet satisfaction that only a season well tended could bring. The year, like the earth, was turning, and every turn brought them closer to the stories that would last. Far beyond the harvest, autumn crept in, not with bluster, but with whispers, a shifting in the wind, a cooling breath at dawn, a subtle change in the songbirds' melodies. The leaves of the fig trees turned first, yellowing and dropping one by one, dancing softly across the courtyard like forgotten scrolls. The skies remained clear, but the light took on a gentler hue, as if the sun itself was softening its touch. Before retreating for winter, Marcus welcomed autumn with a kind of reverence. It was his favorite time, not just for the harvests it brought, but for the feeling it stirred deep in his bones. Reflection, closure, and the satisfaction of cycles completed. This was the time of olives, of grapes bursting on the vines, of granaries being swept clean to make space for new bounty. It was a season of preparing, not only the stores, but the soul. The entire villa became a flurry of ordered motion. Wooden crates were hauled to the vineyard rows, where Julia and Lucan moved between the trellises, their hands stained deep purple from the grapes. Gaius joined the press crew, barefoot and laughing as he danced in the stone vats, squeezing juice from fruit with the joyous clumsiness of youth. Their laughter echoed across the hills, drawing smiles from even the most stoic workers. Livia oversaw the drying of herbs, the careful packing of oils, the jarring of preserved peaches and pickled onions. Her storeroom shelves filled methodically, rows of glistening jars and tied bundles hanging from ceiling hooks. She whispered blessings over them, a habit passed down from her mother, believing it protected the food during winter. Julia began to help her more often, intrigued by the slow, patient rituals of preservation. Marcus spent his days supervising the olive picking, careful not to bruise the fruit. They used wide cloths stretched beneath the trees and shook the branches, gently collecting the firm, green olives before sending them to the press. He reminded everyone that olives were not just a crop, they were legacy. A single tree could live for centuries. "What we harvest today," he said, "was once a whisper in someone else's past." As nights grew cooler, cloaks were brought out from storage, and fires were lit earlier in the hearth. Stories returned to the evening gatherings. Marcus would sit with a mug of warm mulled wine, his voice steady and slow as he recounted the legends of Aeneas and Romulus, or the simpler tales of past harvests and lessons learned. Julia sometimes read from her journal, her words more poetic, now more thoughtful. She was maturing, not just in age but in spirit. One evening, as golden smoke curled up from the chimneys and an owl called gently from the barn rafters, Marcus walked alone through the olive grove. The trees stood like sentinels in the moonlight, their branches heavy with fruit, their roots deep in stories older than memory. He thought of his father, who had walked the same path, and of his grandfather before that. Each had passed through the same seasons. Each had watched the same moon rise. And now Marcus stood here, holding their memories like tools in his hands. Julia found him there, carrying a wool cloak. She wrapped it around his shoulders without a word and stood beside him. They didn't speak because nothing needed to be said. The silence between them was filled with understanding. The grape harvest was completed by the end of October. The wine would ferment slowly in clay amphorae sealed with wax, hidden in the cellar's cool darkness. The olives were pressed and stored. The final sheaves of barley and lentils were brought in and threshed. The granaries filled. The year's work, the endless hours under sun and rain, the hands stained with earth, the backs bent and straightened, again was now safely tucked away. Winter was not feared. It was respected. And in respecting it, they had learned how to live with it. The villa slowed like a deep breath being held. The animals grew thick with their winter coats. Chickens huddled together in straw-lined coops, and sheep were brought down from the hills. Repairs were made to roofing and fences. Marcus spent more time indoors, teaching Julia about contracts and ledgers, about how to read the stars and mark the solstices. She listened closely. She had grown into her role, not by force, but by presence, by being there through every turn of the year. Her understanding was rooted not just in instruction, but in feeling, in the heat of a summer field, the sting of winter wind, the scent of tilled spring soil. And one evening, as the final leaves fell from the almond tree, Marcus declared that she was ready, not to take over, not yet, but to be part of it fully, to guide it forward, to remember its past, to live with the land, not above it. They gathered that night in the great hall, fire crackling, bread breaking, wine flowing, workers, family, neighbors, all together. And Marcus stood, raising his cup. "To the earth," he said, "to its turning, to the hands that tend it, and the hearts that love it." Julia stood beside him, raising her own cup. Her smile was steady, her gaze clear. "To the seasons," she said, "and to those who walk through them, gently, patiently, and with hope." The hall rang with toasts and laughter. Outside, the stars shone cold and clear. The year was ending, but nothing was ever truly over. The earth would turn again. The seeds would sleep beneath the soil. And soon, spring would come once more. And with it, another farmer's year. The winter sun rose later and lingered low across the horizon, casting long golden beams that slanted through the villa's open corridors and flickered gently against the worn mosaic floors. Frost would coat the vineyard posts some mornings, melting slowly as the day awakened. It was the quietest time of the year, a pause that demanded respect, reflection, and stillness. The land slept, and in many ways, so did the people who lived upon it. Inside the villa, warmth came not only from the hearth, but from the closeness of family and ritual. Marcus believed deeply in keeping minds active through the winter months. The work shifted inward, reading scrolls, maintaining tools, repairing harnesses, and mapping out the coming year's crops. Julia became his apprentice in this rhythm, studying soil compositions and rainfall patterns, learning to plan sowing times not just by date, but by feel, by instinct. Evenings brought the deepest sense of togetherness. In the triclinium, the family would gather, draped in wool, eating porridge sweetened with dried figs and honey, or warm barley stew cooked over the hearth. Julia, now older and more assured, would ask questions about trade routes, about the nature of Roman law, about how her father chose which crops to rotate. And Marcus, patient and pleased, would answer every one. He saw in her not just curiosity, but a natural connection to the land that could not be taught. Lucan often retreated to the stable during these months, building a sleigh from leftover wood with guidance from the head carpenter. Gaius, ever full of laughter, made it his mission to find new ways to entertain the household. He created simple plays based on myths, roping in his siblings and even the workers' children to act out the adventures of Persephone, Demeter, and Bacchus. Their makeshift stage, a row of hay bales in the barn, rang with laughter and joy, warming even the frostest corners of the estate. Outdoors, winter was not idle. The sheep needed extra feeding, and the orchard trees had to be pruned. The stream beside the olive grove sometimes swelled after heavy rain, and workers took care to reinforce the small stone bridge. Life slowed, yes, but it never stopped. Even the hibernating earth held within it the pulse of spring yet to come. One day, during a rare but heavy snowfall, Julia found herself walking beside her father through the vineyards, now bare of grapes, but beautiful in their slumber. The snow muffled the world into a soft hush, broken only by the gentle crunch of their boots on the path. They paused at the edge of the hill, looking out at the valley blanketed in white. "This is when I listen," Marcus said quietly. Julia tilted her head. "To what?" "To everything. The ground speaks clearest in winter. It tells you where it's hungry, where it's tired, where it wants to breathe." Julia looked out across the land. "I never thought of it that way." "You will." He smiled. "Give it time. You're already listening. You just haven't noticed yet." Winter festivals broke the quiet now and then. The Saturnalia celebration filled the villa with music and mirth. Roles where reversed slaves were served by their masters, and Julia wore a garland of pine, laughing as she passed out gifts of nuts and dried fruit. There was dancing and storytelling, and feasts that reminded everyone that life was not just work, but joy too. Livia made special honey cakes and poured warm spiced wine for guests, her calm energy anchoring the celebration knot. As the weeks passed, the sun began to rise a little earlier. Tiny buds could be seen on the almond trees near the villa wall. The soil, long resting, began to stir just beneath the surface. Marcus would walk the fields with his hand pressed low, fingers brushing the earth, as if greeting an old friend returning from sleep. Spring came not all at once, but like a gentle visitor, tender, careful, and patient. Birds returned, singing songs that had been missing for months. The bees, hidden deep in their hives, began to hum again. Shoots pushed through the thawed ground, tiny and bright. The plows came out, cleaned and sharpened. Oxen were yoked and fields turned over. Marcus guided Julia in choosing where to plant the legumes this year, which corners of the land should lie fallow, which soil had grown tired, and which had become rich with time. Her journals now included sketches and soil samples, pressed wildflowers, and observations written in thoughtful, practiced script. And then came the planting. Seeds, held over from last year's harvest, were returned to the earth with reverence. Each one, Marcus reminded them, carried the potential for another year of life. The children joined in, scattering lentils and barley, peas and flax. The air buzzed with anticipation. Evenings returned to longer light. The hearth fire was lit later, the air perfumed with damp soil and the scent of budding fruit trees. Julia began reading aloud at night from scrolls about agriculture, philosophy, and the stars. Her voice had grown strong, assured. The others listened, not because she was the eldest daughter, but because she had earned their respect. Season by season. By mid-spring, the villa was once again alive with full purpose. The garden bloomed. The first harvest of herbs began. Sheep were sheared, their wool piled high in the spinning room. The air buzzed with insects, and the roads grew busier with travelers and merchants. And in all of it, every motion, every turning leaf, every grain sown and reaped, there was a rhythm. A rhythm Julia had now come to know not just by learning, but by living. A rhythm passed down in hands that tilled, in hearts that waited, in eyes that watched the land more closely than the sky. And so the cycle renewed, quietly and powerfully. The farmer's year was never finished. It folded into itself, season upon season, each one carrying lessons and memories. And Julia was no longer just walking through it, she was part of it. A thread in the great woven cloth of time, earth, and care. The days that followed the planting carried with them a soft sense of victory, the kind that came not with fanfare, but with quiet satisfaction. In the golden light of early summer, the villa thrummed gently with motion, not hurried, not frantic, but purposeful. The soil had been turned, the seeds buried like whispered promises, and now the waiting began. Julia awoke each morning with the birdsong rising before the heat claimed the day. She walked barefoot through the dew-covered fields, her toes sinking into the moist earth as she moved between rows of barley and lentils just beginning to sprout. The smell of the land earthy, green and alive filled her lungs, grounding her more deeply than ever before. She no longer needed her father's guidance to recognize when the wind carried signs of change or when the shade of a leaf told of subtle imbalance in the soil. Her bond with the land had become wordless. The villa, too, moved with the pace of summer. Workers carried baskets filled with herbs to be dried. Oregano, thyme, and mint hung from rafters in the kitchen courtyard, filling the air with fragrance. Bees buzzed lazily in the sun, hovering near blossoming fruit trees that promised sweet figs and plums in the months to come. Chickpeas flourished in the warmth, their delicate leaves trembling in the breeze. Marcus watched all this with a quiet pride. His hands bore the calluses of decades spent in communion with the land, but now they often rested behind his back, allowing Julia to take more of the reins. He guided with stories now, memories of seasons long past, of droughts weathered, of floods survived, of experimental planting that had led to disaster or unexpected bounty. "You'll make your own mistakes," he said one evening as they watched the sun fall behind the hills, the vineyard's shadows lengthening like ink stains across the fields. "But those are the ones that stay with you." Julia nodded, understanding that wisdom wasn't in avoiding failure, but in listening deeply enough to learn from it. Lucan had taken to the animals. He had a knack for calming even the most stubborn of oxen, and knew just how to coax a newborn lamb from its frightened mother. Livia began teaching him to mix salves and tinctures, preparing him not just to tend animals, but to heal them. His laughter rang out often in the barn, warm and full of life. Gaius, as ever, brought the joy. He composed small songs and riddles about the fields, and sneaked them into the lunch baskets of workers. His stories grew longer, filled with talking. Rabbits and heroic crows, and he often told them while perched on hay bales, drawing an eager crowd. Even the older workers, weathered and sun-darkened, paused to listen. As midsummer approached, the land bloomed fully. The wheat turned gold, rustling like soft waves in the wind. Olive trees bore heavy fruit, their silvery leaves shimmering. The early harvest began a flurry of activity that brought sweat and satisfaction in equal measure. The air hummed with the scrape of sickles, the creak of carts, the rustle of grain sacks being filled and stored. At the heart of it all, Julia moved with calm command. She distributed water carefully to the workers, checked the press for the early olive yield, and oversaw the weighing of grain. Livia kept the kitchen running like a song. Barley bread baking in clay ovens, cool jugs of watered wine set beneath fig trees, fresh cheese wrapped in herbs. During this season, the villa hosted a small festival. Not a grand affair like the public celebrations in Rome, but a private, sacred one, a thanks to Ceres, goddess of agriculture. A table was laid with offerings, sheaves of wheat, ripe apricots, and braided loaves shaped like the sun. Songs were sung, hands joined, and for one evening, even work rested. Julia stood before the altar as the youngest woman of the household, her hands cupped with grain, her eyes closed in silent prayer. She did not speak aloud, but her thoughts were clear. Gratitude for the land, for the lessons, and for the seasons yet to come. The moon was high by the time the laughter faded and the last lanterns were extinguished. The fields, now bathed in silver light, looked endless, and Julia knew deeply and without question that this was her path. Not because it had been given to her, but because she had grown into it. The story of the land was not written in scrolls or told in marble halls. It lived here in dirt beneath fingernails, in calloused hands, in hearts tuned to the rise and fall of the sun. And it would continue, season after season, through quiet evenings and busy dawns. In every seed planted and every harvest shared, the farmer's year never truly ended. It simply circled back, richer each time. As the days of high summer ripened into late season warmth, a stillness settled over the land, not the dormancy of winter, but the kind of calm that comes when all living things have found their rhythm. The sun still blazed in the afternoons, but mornings and evenings carried a breath of coolness, a gentle reminder that the wheel of time was turning once again. Julia awoke before the dawn as always. The chirring of cicadas had given way to the soft clicking of crickets, and the sky outside her small window bore the faintest hue of rose. Slipping on her sandals, she made her way to the veranda, where the horizon stretched wide and open, layered with the dusky greens of olive groves and the warm browns of harvested wheat fields. The scent of summer's end filled the air. Basil drying on racks, crushed fig leaves underfoot, the faint sweetness of fermenting grapes in clay amphorae near the press. Gaius had left another one of his scrolls on the steps, scribbled with a poem about bees and barley. She smiled, tucking it into her sash. His imagination had flourished alongside the crops, and even the field hands had begun quoting his little verses while working. By midday, the farm bustled with harvest work again. The grape pickers moved in pairs through the vines, placing clusters of deep purple grapes into woven baskets. Julia helped them sort, separating the firm, ripe fruit from the overripe or shriveled, and her fingers were stained a rich, dusky red by the time they broke for rest. The pressing would begin that evening. In the shade of the courtyard, Livia prepared for the sacred pressing ritual. It wasn't just winemaking, it was a celebration, a closing of one chapter and the honoring of another. Clay bowls were laid out with honey, fresh bread, and almonds for the workers. A garland of laurel leaves was placed on the large wooden press, and everyone wore simple white tunics to mark the purity of the moment. As twilight fell, torches were lit around the perimeter of the vineyard. The air shimmered with warmth, perfumed by the crushed fruit, the faint scent of smoke from the outdoor ovens, and the mingling laughter of workers and family alike. Julia's heart stirred with something close to reverence. Lucan stepped up to the press first, barefoot and grinning. With a theatrical bow, he stepped into the vat, and laughter erupted as he began the traditional stomping. Gaius joined him, mimicking his older brother's every move, and soon others followed, forming a rhythm as old as timed feet in motion, hands clapping, voices rising in song. Even Marcus, though slower now, lifted his voice, singing verses of an old farming hymn his father had once sung. Julia watched them, chest full, eyes misting just slightly. This, she thought, was the heart of the year, not the struggle, not the yield, but the moment of sharing. The celebration of what had come from the land, from their hands, from their hearts. Later that night, after the press had stilled and the vats were sealed, Julia sat with her father by the low wall overlooking the southern fields. The moon bathed the earth in silver again, softening the lines of the land. Amphorae lined the walls behind them, waiting for the new wine. "Do you think they'll remember this?" she asked quietly. Marcus didn't answer right away. His gaze swept over the fields, lingering on the barn, the vineyard, the little grove of pomegranate trees they had planted in spring. "They will," he said at last, "because it becomes part of them." "The earth changes us more than we change it," Julia nodded. In her chest, something settled. A sense of belonging not to a place, but to a living rhythm that spanned generations. As autumn approached, the last of the fruit was gathered. Apples were stored in baskets, lined with straw. Walnuts were spread on mats in the sun to dry. Oxen were groomed and stabled more frequently now, their coats thickening with the coming change. Livia began her preparations for winter drying beans, preserving olives in brine, bottling the last of the honey. Gaius was tasked with carving small wooden lids for storage jars, each etched with tiny symbols, sunbursts, vines, little birds. He took the job seriously, often pausing to think hard before choosing a design. Lucan repaired tools, reshaping handles, mending yokes, and keeping count of supplies. His hands had grown strong, and Julia saw her father's steady diligence taking root in his every movement. As for Julia, she began sketching plans for the next season. The east field, she decided, would be better suited for flax than barley. This year, she consulted the stars for signs, watching the changing patterns in the sky like her grandfather had taught her. A dry winter, perhaps. Preparations were needed, but with each day of planning, she also made space for reflection. The final evening of harvest, a quiet one without songs or feasts. Julia walked alone to the northern ridge where the land met the sky. She sat with her knees pulled to her chest, watching the sun slip below the hills. She thought of the year behind her, the uncertainty, the growth, the closeness of her family, and the ever-turning wheel of time that marked each season like pages in a sacred book. When she rose and turned to walk home, the stars had emerged, first one, then many, as if the sky itself was gently applauding the close of the farmer's year. The days grew shorter, the sun casting long amber shadows across the fields in the late afternoon. Julia wrapped her shawl more tightly around her shoulders as she walked from the olive press to the granary. The air had a crispness now, not biting, but steady, a reminder that the warm embrace of summer had truly passed. Autumn had set in, fully, with leaves turning the shade of ripe apricots and ochre, swirling along stone pathways with each gentle gust. Inside the granary, Lucan was organizing sacks of barley and wheat. He greeted her with a nod and wiped his hands on his tunic. "We'll have enough to carry through the winter," he said, pride threading through his voice. Julia glanced at the tall, neat rows of sacks, each labeled with the date and field of origin. "It's more than enough," she replied. "You've done well." Outside, Gaius chased after a chicken that had escaped the coop, his laughter ringing out into the crisp afternoon. Livia stood by the herb garden, tying up bundles of sage and rosemary for drying. The scent of garlic hung faintly in the air, and nearby, clay jars filled with pickled vegetables were lined up in careful rows under the covered terrace. Preparations for winter weren't just practical, they were sacred. They meant readiness, they meant survival. But in this household, they also meant tradition, the honoring of every season's labor and the blessings the earth had provided. Marcus, now slower but no less sharp, oversaw the work with quiet satisfaction. He would often sit beneath the mulberry tree near the courtyard, carving small trinkets from olive wood figures of sheep, birds, even the occasional playful likeness of one of his grandchildren. He gave them away without ceremony, slipping them into pockets or placing them atop door frames where they might be discovered unexpectedly. That evening, as the family gathered around the fire inside the domus, the warmth from the flames drew them into a close, calm circle. The walls glowed golden from the torchlight, and the smell of chestnut stew filled the room. Livia passed around small bowls of pomegranate seeds, drizzled with honey. Gaius nestled beside his mother, clutching his latest poem, a tender line about the stars above the vineyard. Julia kissed the top of his head, her heart brimming with a quiet joy. She looked around at her family faces soft in the firelight, eyes reflecting peace, and felt deeply rooted, like the oldest olive tree in their grove. After dinner, Lucan brought out a scroll one he had begun writing with Marcus, a record of their farming methods, planting patterns, and the rituals they followed through the year. It was more than a ledger. It was a guide for future generations. Gaius listened intently as Lucan read it aloud, and even Julia found herself leaning in, warmed not just by the hearth, but by the sense of continuity that pulsed through their home. Outside, the night deepened. A full moon climbed over the hills, spilling silver across the rooftops and fields. The world seemed to breathe slower, quieter, as if all of nature had joined in a deep, contented sigh. The coming days passed gently. The final olives were pressed, their green gold oil stored in amphorae sealed with beeswax. The cattle were moved to the winter shelter, and the goats' coats had thickened for the colder nights. Frost began to kiss the grass in the early mornings, sparkling like crushed glass underfoot. One morning, a traveler passed through a merchant on his way south to the port. He stopped to barter for oil and figs, and spent a night in the guest room. Over a shared cup of warm wine, he marveled at the quiet beauty of their life. "You live like the old poets wrote," he said to Julia. "Your home is like a verse, simple, strong, full of rhythm." Julia smiled at that. She liked the thought. A verse of life, where each season was a line, each harvest a gentle rhyme. As winter approached in earnest, the family shifted indoors. The hearth became their heart, a place of storytelling, planning, teaching. Gaius now copied letters by candlelight, his tongue tucked into the corner of his mouth as he practiced his script. Lucan continued to write in the farming scroll, adding new thoughts from the season just past. Julia spent her evenings weaving, the soft rhythm of shuttle and thread like a lullaby in the quiet room. Even the animals slowed. The hens laid fewer eggs, the bees clustered in their hives, and the fields, once vibrant and singing with life, now rested beneath a veil of mist and silence. And still, the land remained alive, just waiting, storing its strength for the cycle to begin again. On the eve of Saturnalia, their modest celebration was held not extravagant, but heartfelt. Wreaths of holly and ivy hung by the doorway. Livia prepared honey cakes, and Marcus shared stories of his own childhood winters. Lucan lit the ceremonial candle, placing it in the window as a symbol of light returning, of warmth in the darkness. When the festival passed, The world outside was still. The farm slept, blanketed in frost and silence. On one such winter's night, Julia stood again at the northern ridge, just as she had at harvest's end. The stars wheeled above her in ancient patterns, and the cold bit gently at her cheeks. But inside her was a warmth that the season couldn't touch, the quiet triumph of a year well lived, of roots deepened, of seasons honored. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. The land, the sky, the rhythm of the year had all understood. And as she walked slowly home, each step soft in the pale dusting of snow, the final lines of her father's favorite saying echoed in her heart, "The earth does not forget the hands that tended." The earliest days of the new year unfurled quietly over the countryside, blanketing the farm in a deep stillness that only winter could bring. Though the days remained short and the air crisp, the family stirred with a slow but hopeful rhythm. Nature slumbered, yet beneath the surface, unseen life patiently awaited the call of spring. Inside the villa, the family remained active, not in the way of fieldwork, but in rituals of preparation. Wool was spun near the hearth, olives were sorted again for quality, and dried herbs were measured into earthen jars for trade. Julia stood by the window most mornings, watching the light change. It was subtle each sunrise, just a little earlier, a sky a shade lighter. These were the signs she waited for, and she read them like verses from an old scroll. Lucan spent the quiet months maintaining tools. He polished the plow's iron, rewound the ropes, and oiled the hinges on gates. He taught Gaius how to recognize the grain in wood, how to choose the right branches for repairs. These were lessons not found in books, but passed hand to hand, voice to ear steady, timeless and grounding. Marcus, ever the silent observer, took to dictating reflections to Lucan. These weren't just about the farm, but about life, what the river teaches when it floods, what the fields reveal when they refuse to yield. They became short philosophical notes tied to the seasons. Lucan added them at the margins of the farming scroll, and sometimes Gaius copied them into his own growing collection of parchment pages. By the end of the month, Gaius had grown fascinated with time. "The stars move slow," he said one night, watching the sky beside his mother. "But they always return." Julia smiled softly. "Everything does in its season." In the barns, the goats now bleated louder in the cold mornings, eager for feed and company. The cattle, heavy with winter coats, shifted lazily in their stalls. Livia checked them daily, whispering soft words to them, patting their broad sides, and feeding them dried fig leaves and grain. The animals knew her. They trusted her voice, her touch. They were family too, in a way bound by routine, by care, by the invisible threads of a shared life. Midwinter's day came and went with a quiet feast. No great noise, no crowds, just bread, stewed lentils, winter apples, and laughter shared in the flickering light of oil lamps. Gaius recited one of his poems, and Marcus smiled with closed eyes, mouthing the lines as if he had written them himself. It was during these slow days that Julia found herself thinking more about her mother, who had died when she was young. She remembered how her mother's hands had felt warm, always smelling of rosemary and flour. And now, when Julia needed bread in the mornings, she imagined her beside her, guiding her hands with invisible ones. The women of the house spent afternoons weaving a new tapestry for the dining room wall, one that would depict the passing of seasons on their land. The borders were threaded with wheat sheaves and olive branches, and at the center, a great tree stood tall through sun and snow. Gaius helped with the design, sketching tiny figures. Marcus under the tree, Lucan sowing seeds, and even Livia with a basket of herbs. With every stitch, the tapestry grew not just in thread, but in memory. As February neared its end, the changes became more visible. Buds swelled on the branches of almond trees. Birds returned to the hedges, calling out in pairs. The soil, though still cool and damp, began to breathe again. And Julia knew it was time. The family prepared the fields once more. It began with offering small rituals handed down through generations. A sprinkling of wine on the earth, a whispered prayer at the boundary stone, a single olive branch laid on the soil with reverence. These acts weren't superstition. They were gratitude. Lucan guided the oxen with steady hands. The plow cut into the earth, turning it over like a fresh page in a scroll. Gaius ran beside him, placing seeds in small pouches for the planters. Julia followed, scattering lentil seeds in rhythm, her feet familiar with the path, her hands sure and practiced dot. As the fields came to life once again, so did the household. The granary doors opened wider. Visitors came more frequently, traders, neighbors, even passing poets who shared verses in exchange for figs or cheese. Laughter grew louder in the evenings, and the aroma of fresh herbs once again danced through the halls. One afternoon, a traveler brought with him news from Rome. New law passed, a new temple built. But Julia listened with calm detachment. Their lives moved to older rhythms, governed by sun and soil, not by marble halls and Senate decrees. By spring's arrival, the land was a sea of green. Wheat sprouted in neat rows, orchards blossomed with pale petals, and bees returned to their hives in a slow hum of promise. Livia's herbs grew tall once more, and Gaius had begun writing poems inspired by each flower he named. In the evenings, they gathered again beneath the mulberry tree. The light was golden, the shadows long but soft. Marcus no longer carved, but he listened, his eyes closed, a gentle smile on his weathered face. Julia sat with her family, watching the sky darken, feeling the warmth of the day linger on her skin. The year had circled again. Seasons had passed with grace and return. There had been labor, laughter, memory, and peace. And as the last star appeared above their quiet farm, Julia whispered the words that her mother once had, the words she now passed to Gaius, who sat beside her. Tend the land, tend your heart, and the earth will always remember.